It's a pleasure to welcome you all for the spring semester and the second half of the year's U.S. foreign policy series. My name is Neil Jock. I'm a co-host with my colleague Daniel Sargent of this series. Let me also draw your attention, brief advertisement, on Monday next week we have Charlie Edel speaking on, and I'll give the exact title, Nation Builder, John Quincy Adams and the Grand Strategy of the Republic. That's on Monday at 2 o'clock, again in this room. So those of you who have time and are interested, our program is focused heavily on practitioners coming primarily from Washington who speak about U.S. foreign policy, but we're also trying to expand our attention a little bit to draw in academic scholars who pay attention to the bigger picture, and Charlie Edel is a good example of that on Monday. So there are flyers to tell you more about that. But I'm happy today to introduce Dr. Carter Malkasian. Let me first point out that he is a Cal grad. He was an undergraduate here, so he's one of our own. For those of you who are undergrads, and I sense that many of you are in my generation rather than being still undergrads, but those of you who are undergrads, you too could be here in a couple of decades if you wish to. Today he's going to be speaking on the prospects for the future of Afghanistan. With U.S. combat troops now removed from Afghanistan, that future certainly hangs in the balance, and Carter, I think, is uniquely qualified to address this topic. After leaving Berkeley, he took a PhD from Oxford. While at Berkeley, by the way, I should add that he studied with Bob Powell, and Bob Powell is still proud of many of his students, and Carter in particular, and we're very glad to have Bob Powell with us to put a little pressure on his former student. Carter has written books on counterinsurgency. He served as a foreign service officer in Iraq, also in Afghanistan. His most recent appointment was as the political advisor to General Joseph Dunford. To give you an idea of the importance of this position, Dunford was the commander of International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan, as well as U.S. Forces Afghanistan, from February 2013 until August 2014. Dunford was the guy in command. He was the guy you go to. Carter was his political advisor. I asked myself as I looked at his CV, how did he end up as a political advisor at this level, which is very significant. To understand it, I would recommend, if you have the same question, to take a look at his book that he just came out with called War Comes to Garmser. It's really an extraordinary book, extraordinary insights to what was going on for American forces in Afghanistan. General Bing West called this book the definitive book on counterinsurgency. John Noggle, by the way, who will also be speaking here in this series, and I refer you to the poster for the specifics about that, called it a great book on Afghanistan. Former U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Ronald Newman, called it brilliantly written, minutely detailed, and rigorously honest. Now, you'd think with all this praise that Carter might think that he's pretty special. He is. We know that. He's a Cal grad. But, you know, when I looked at this book, I looked in vain for a picture of him. You know, in most books, of course, even if you turn to the flyleaf, there's a picture. But Carter is very modest. He has nothing to be modest about. His achievements were extraordinary. But as I looked through this book, I tried to find a picture just, you know, to sort of go along with their pictures of everybody else he talks about. No such luck. So I had to go to a different book in order to satisfy my curiosity. Another book, not as good as Carter's.
It's a very good book, minus that picture.
By Rajiv Chandrasekaran, called Little America. Sure enough, I found a picture of Carter. So here's the picture of Carter. Carter, ouch.
Yes, don't put on a turban in front of a journalist. It doesn't go well for you.
But there's a description in Chandrasekaran's book as well, where he refers to Carter as a slightly nerdy war zone academic.
That one I'm okay with.
Now we're getting to the heart of things. But wait, there's more. It's not just that he's a nerdy academic zone scholar. He's also described in that book, I think quite accurately, in ways that he wouldn't describe himself in his own book, as unfailingly polite, willing to take risks, uncommonly effective. In Washington terms, saying that someone's effective is extremely high praise, and it's something that people want to be. And I think Carter is evident from his experience. Was very effective. He was fluent. He learned Pashto on the ground while he was there. And according to the Marines he worked with, he helped to shape the Marine campaign. General Larry Nicholson said that America needed a Carter Malkasian in every one of the 397 districts in Afghanistan. Finally, perhaps what Carter may be most proud of, many Afghans called him a friend. So Berkeley should be very proud of him for his presence in Afghanistan, for the work he did for the US government. It's a real pleasure to welcome him to Berkeley. So join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Neil. That was quite an introduction. I'm really honored. Do most people stand up for these?
I think it's better so everyone can see
Okay.
if you don't mind.
No, not at all, not at all. So thank you all for coming today. It's really an honor to be able to come here and speak and talk about Afghanistan for a little bit. Usually in my talks, I try to tell people let's ask questions throughout the whole way, and so we have a good interactive discussion. In this case, I fear that I'm going to say things a little controversial. So I'm going to try to go through the whole talk, and then I think there'll be a question and answer period after that. And hopefully, as I go through the whole thing, the points that seem controversial in the beginning are more understandable at the end. And so, the books that I brought here, they're not for sale. They're first come, first serve for whoever would like a copy. I thought that would be an okay thing to do. So Afghanistan, I think, as you know, has been a struggle for the United States. Whether it's been worth it, whether or not we've lost, are questions that loom large, I think, for the American people and certainly in Washington. The goal of the presentation today is to describe how we've come to this situation. I want to highlight some of the key mistakes, identify ways that we could have done things differently. And there's kind of 4 points to the argument. The first point is that there was a chance between 2001 and 2005 for a better situation than the one we face today. The second point is that, unfortunately, after this time passed, our chances to get to a better situation really decreased. And it's hard for me to see a way that we could have gotten to a place now where we'd see Afghanistan standing on its own with little support from us. And the main reason for this, which may be a little controversial, is that I think that Islam and Afghan identity gave the Taliban an enduring legitimacy that we weren't going to be able to match. And I don't mean that as any kind of slur against Afghan identity or Islam at all. I think it's just something that was the facts of the situation. The third point is that what is more, it's unclear to me after 2001, it's unclear to me where really the United States could have left the war. I don't see too many opportunities that existed there, which gives the whole event this kind of tragic inevitability to it. And the first point, the last point, which is the worst of all of them, is that after 13 years of war, I have to wonder if we've done more harm than good to the Afghan people. Now, to get to these conclusions, first I want to describe oh, I didn't do that right. There we go. First I want to describe the situation in Afghanistan today. I think that's probably a little bit of interest to people. And then I want to talk to the mistakes and the dynamics that led to this result. I have various ideas on different directions and strategies the United States can undertake now, but I think it's best to leave those for the discussion at the end. And I start with 2014 because it offers insights into the past and an idea of where things are going. 2014 is the first year that we really had fewer troops on the ground, and the Afghans faced a lot of challenges. There was elections. How that year is gone gives us a better understanding of the future. So if you look at 2013, this is a map of Afghanistan. The light gray areas are the places in early 2013 that the Taliban movement had influence, had a great deal of control. This is the time, in spring 2013, when the Afghan government was at the height of its power. It controlled more territory than it had for a long period since 2005. Most of the districts and provinces that are of great importance to the country were under its control. There are 352,000 police and army. Karzai, whatever you think of it, had managed to manage the country in a way that there hadn't been a lot of ethnic divisions that had occurred yet. That's 2013. 2014 put all this to the test. U.S. forces drew down. There were continued Taliban attacks. There was a president elected, and I'll talk about how that went. But overall, how 2014 went was not so good. It showed that the verdict wasn't terribly promising for the future. And so this is a map of the same thing, but currently what the situation is. And the gray is, again, the area that's under Taliban control. On the battlefield in 2014, the Taliban launched their biggest offensive in years. They smashed a lot of the Afghan forces in various provinces. Nearly 1,200 Taliban attacked northern Helmand here, which has been a difficult area. After that, large numbers attacked in Kandahar. And then we had later offensives in Kunduz and in Kunar over here. In these battles, the government, they didn't always lose. There's places that the army and the government performed well and the people truly believed in the government. But there's also been many places where ground was lost. And it's disappointing because the Afghan government had suspected for months the Taliban would attack. But nevertheless, in many places, they weren't prepared. They didn't give their troops enough ammunition. They didn't make sure that their posts were properly manned. They didn't have enough. They didn't have enough troops ready to go. So in a lot of places, troops would run out of ammunition. Police would run out of ammunition. They'd be unable to counter the Taliban. In contrast, the Taliban were aggressive, sometimes inspired. They had high morale and ample ammunition. In many places, what's worse is in Afghanistan, you have an army and a police force. We'd expect the army to perform well and to be fairly intent on holding back the Taliban. In many places, the army wouldn't go and help the police. The army preferred to stay in its posts. And this is because in Afghanistan, the army and the police have different chains of command, different people they answer to. The police chief doesn't have to listen to what the army commander says, and vice versa. The army commander doesn't have to listen to anything the police chief has to say. So this has a degree of disorder, and often the army would just prefer to stay in their posts. And if an experienced Taliban cadre leader in Helmand during the battle, he noticed the discord, and he said, as long as there is not mutual distrust, mutual understanding between government military entities, we will become stronger and stronger. Events on the political front were just as worrisome as the battlefield. So this was the year of elections. There was a set of elections that occurred in Afghanistan, which I suspect most of you have heard about. At the end of it, there were two candidates, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah. But unfortunately, as these elections started to get going, underlying ethnic tensions started to bubble back up. Abdullah is a Tajik, and many of the Tajiks, which are about 20% of the population in Afghanistan, they started to align with Abdullah, as did some of the other minorities. At the same time, the Pashtuns went towards Ashraf Ghani. They felt that they deserved to be in charge, that they had a right to rule the country because they had ruled the countries for centuries. And corruption starts, fraud starts. There were many people who were Pashtuns on Ghani's side who were willing to commit fraud. Ghani didn't order it himself, but they so wanted him to become president that they were willing to rig the vote, stuff ballots, do these kinds of activities. And many of these young Pashtuns didn't let their Western educations get in their way as they did this. So in the second and final round of elections on 14 June, fraud was rampant. Turnout numbers begged credulity. In some provinces, more people voted than there was a voting age population. This, of course, upset Abdullah's camp greatly, made them very concerned about the situation, so that on 7 July, when preliminary results are announced and Ghani comes ahead, the Abdullah camp and the Tajiks are extremely upset about this, and they believe they've been cheated. When those results are announced in Kabul, there's fighting in the streets, not to the scale of a massive riot, but the two groups of camps, they're coming in the streets, there's blows are exchanged, sometimes shots are fired. There's concerns about which side the police are going to be on. And the next thing the Abdullah camp does is start planning to secede, to declare a parallel government where the northern part of the country breaks off from the southern part of the country. And many people, many Americans didn't believe this was possible. This couldn't possibly be happening. This is all a bluff. I can assure you it was not a bluff. They were extremely serious about it because they saw losing power as losing money, losing the ability to secure themselves, so they would rather secede than face that situation. It spread to the police and the army. There were army commanders who went up to talk to Abdullah to say, what should we do in this situation? Much of the army is Tajik like Abdullah is. So it was a real crisis for the United States at this point. Now, fortunately, President Obama and Secretary Kerry stepped in, made it clear what our policy was and what the ramifications would be of secession occurring, and were able to force an agreement that there would be a unity government, which I think was probably necessary for that to happen. Now, the unity government, unfortunately, hasn't been terribly efficient. It's taken a long time for them to pick ministers. It's unclear what Ghani's powers are versus Abdullah's powers, and it's running fairly slowly. This doesn't give many people a lot of confidence about how well it's going to be able to rule in the future. And the Taliban, of course, have noticed all of these things happening. They've noticed the situation in the fighting. They've noticed what's been happening with elections. So we had the opportunity to, I know a good number of Afghans and Afghan academics, and some of them I trust to a certain extent. And I was able to poll 45 Taliban commanders, religious leaders, and people who were active and involved. And so we asked them a variety, I shouldn't say poll, it's more like we had a bunch of indirect interviews with them, and they brought back the information, we had a set of questions. We asked them what they thought about the situation, what they thought about the fighting season, what they thought about what was going on in the elections. So simply the size of their offensives impressed them. Regardless of if they won or lost, just the fact that they could put that many people in the field they thought was impressive. All but one of those we talked to said Taliban influence has increased since 2008, and all but one said there would be no peace before a total U.S. withdrawal. Taliban took heart in the political discord surrounding the elections. I often heard a Pashtun proverb. It's other people's quarrels are free entertainment. So they're looking on the situation, seeing things fall apart, seeing an opportunity. One Taliban cadre commander from Ghazni boasted, "You can imagine our influence from the election. After 13 years, still a whole world, and the Afghan puppet government is not able to hold an election." So the dark conclusion out of 2014 is that the war is far from over. If the Taliban gained ground when there were few Americans left, what's going to happen when there are none of us left, or even fewer of us left? We hoped that 2014 would be the year that showed we could leave. I think it may have shown the opposite, and Afghanistan's prospects look grim. So how did we get to this point in Afghanistan? It begs that, I think this whole situation begs that question. I think the best chance to have avoided this situation would have been between 2001 and 2005. During that time, the government had a good amount of popular support. The Taliban were going to Pakistan or were going back to their homes and wanted some degree of peace. But unfortunately, we let most of those opportunities slip. Now, first, angry over 11 September and overconfident in our victory in 2001, we excluded the Taliban from any kind of peace settlement. We ignored Churchill's advice of magnanimity and victory. So Mullah Omar, during the last days of his regime, tried to negotiate a peace deal with Hamid Karzai. He sent a delegation of his senior people to talk to Karzai when Karzai was advancing on Kandahar. And things were discussed along the lines of, if Taliban lay down arms, or maybe not lay down arms, but go to our homes, stop creating violence. We're willing to recognize you as a legitimate ruler, but we want to have some part in the peace settlement. Now, can we work something out on these lines? That was brought up to the U.S. government. And Rumsfeld, in a press conference, personally vetoed the idea. After that, the Taliban didn't give up. They kept on trying to negotiate. More delegations were sent to Kabul. And Karzai brought that up to the United States again. And we said, no, we're not going to have any of that. In fact, all the people who we might negotiate with, they're on a list of people we're going to detain. So there wasn't any willingness to negotiate at that point. The message gets back to Mullah Omar on this. He forms the Quetta Shura, the ruling body of the Taliban. They start preparing for more war. So that's one opportunity that was lost. And at the same time, as we push the Taliban on a course of renewed war, we don't do much to protect the Afghan people, to protect the state that we're trying to build. The army we built very slowly. An army that we plan to make it 70,000. We want it highly professional, build it slowly, make it sustainable. But what that resulted in is that in 2006, there was only 36,000 Afghan soldiers ready to defend their country. So that's not nearly enough to take care of the situation they were going to be facing. And it's a little bit like the Treaty of Versailles, that we both punished the defeated too much, and we didn't do enough to defend the people who we were trying to help. Now, I'd say these are both foreseeable mistakes, and they would have opened, if we hadn't taken them, I think they would have opened possibilities towards a different future, because these were big mistakes, and there were still opportunities in Afghanistan. There's other things that didn't help. We were dedicated to counter-terrorist operations that often harmed innocent Afghans. We didn't press Karzai to curb the abuses of various warlords and governors that were working under him. We also turned our attention to Iraq, and I probably don't need to say anything about that. So we get ourselves in a situation where we haven't done enough in the first few years. These are the most important years of the war. And then in 2006, the Taliban attack. And they attack in large numbers and take a large amount of the countryside in the south, in the east. Thousands of insurgents attacked. And this wasn't so much an occasion of an internal revolt against the government as it was people coming from the outside, from areas of Pakistan, areas of the country that weren't in government control, and attacking various districts and taking things over. Now, you may ask yourself, okay, so Karzai didn't have an army. The Taliban don't have an army. They managed to mobilize their people, talk to their people, raise people up. Why couldn't Karzai do something like that? Why couldn't Karzai work with the tribes to try to protect the area that he had? So many tribes were with Karzai and were with the government. The problem was that the tribes are competing amongst each other a lot. They are trying to increase their own power. There's no organization or central structure among them. So when the Taliban came, the tribes, some of them fought, some of them went home, some of them went and joined the Taliban. That structure couldn't work. There was too much disorder among them. And you may say, well, isn't it the government's job to enforce that kind of order? Perhaps, but the government itself was riven by differences and difficulties and different patronage networks and different warlords fighting for power. The palace itself, Karzai himself, didn't want to see tribes come together because it might have been a threat to his political power. So he tried to divide them. So in the end, the tribal and government leaders were like the great powers fighting Napoleon. They were unable to form an alliance to defeat a common threat. I'd say 2006 was probably the most decisive event of the war. It changed the nature of the war. It brought war back. And in many ways, that's what we've spent years trying to reverse, trying to repeal. And it's the framework, the skeleton of that situation is still what we face today. The surge of 2009 and 2012 was America's largest attempt to turn the tide. Cleared a great deal of ground. It stabilized districts, recruited hundreds of thousands of people, and if you look at the statistics, if you walk the ground, you could see it, you could know that it changed things for that time. But in the end, it was still a failure. In the end of it, the Taliban still controlled a large amount of ground and were able to attack again, as I tried to show during the first part of the discussion. So I think this leads to the greatest question of the war. How could the outnumbered Taliban hold on over 8 years in spite of the best attempts of the United States to thwart them? I think there's been many arguments put forward. The United States neglected to deal with corruption. Karzai was an awful leader. Counterinsurgency was poorly implemented. Pakistan. And to me, all these things played a role, and I'm happy to discuss them during the discussion part of it. But I think they miss the larger picture. I think the Taliban had an appeal and an ability to organize and discipline themselves that the Western-installed government could never match. I think they stood for Islam, they stood for Afghan identity, and this was sufficient for Afghanistan to be a long war after 2006. And I say some of this because after my time in Afghanistan, you look into all these different ways that the situation could have gone better. The governance was a little bit better if we had put troops here instead of putting them there. If you had changed some leaders around. But over time, I felt like I was missing the elephant staring me in the face, which is about identity and about larger ideas that motivate people to do things. And so I'll break, and hopefully I don't run my time out by telling a little story really quick. So I know some people from Helmand very well. I've spent a lot of time with them. I've driven with them in their cars places. I've gone to their homes. I trust them. I trust they will protect me if something was to happen to me. So in last year, our base in the middle of Helmand closed. So I couldn't go there easily anymore. But I wanted to go there. I wanted to see how things were. This is a place I spent 2 years. I wanted to see how the people were doing. I wanted to see if the things we had done had really made a difference, if they were still holding. So I know two people there very well. One is a technocrat, and the other is, and his name is Ayub Omar. He's a young man. The other one is an old, grizzled, I'd like to call him a benevolent warlord, but a man who has seen a lot of fighting, and that's Abdullah John. And so I called Ayub Omar, and I said, so I was thinking about coming down to Helmand. He said, that's a great idea. Come down, we'll host you, we'll help you, we'll take care of things. Everyone will be so happy to see you. So I waited, I got all the arrangements, got a flight, a civilian flight to go down to Helmand, worked everything out to go, and I called him 2 days before, and I said, hey, it's good, I'm ready to go. I'll be here, tomorrow at 10 a.m., whatever the time was. Can you come pick me up? He said, oh, of course, Carter, it's be good to have you here. But there was just a little hesitation in his voice. So I turned on the phone, thought for 2 to 3 minutes, picked it back up, said, hey, look, you know what? I know you're busy right now. I can tell. I don't want to bother you. We'll do this in a month or two. Oh, okay, sounds good. So then about a week later, Abdullah John, the grizzled warlord, comes to Kabul. And I'm talking to him. He said, Carter, you don't come to Helmand. Why haven't you come to Helmand? I said, well, I'd like to come, but the base isn't there anymore. If I come, I need to come on a civilian flight. And you're going to have to pick me up from the airport. I'm going to have to stay at your house. And people are going to see me there. Because you're not going to be able to hide me. I know you can't, because too many people come through. And I know you'll protect me. But I think that after I leave, people are going to call you a kafir. That's a Pashto word for infidel. It's not the word for the other meaning of that word. They're going to call you an infidel. And after I leave, they're going to tar you with that. And people may even try to come and hurt you. And he looked at the ground and said, Carter, you're right. It's good you realize that. So, you figure out how to come down with the military, however, and I'll see you in Helmand then, but you're right about this. So I left, and I thought, all right, so either I made the right decision by not going, or he thinks I'm a total coward and is being really, really nice to me. So about 2 weeks, actually, no, 6 months later, 6 months later, I'm in Kabul, and I have Ayub Omar, the young technocrat, and Abdullah John, the older fellow. We're having dinner. And in the middle of the dinner, unprompted, I hadn't said anything, Abdullah John, the older man, says to the younger man, you know, Carter understood something. He understood if he comes down, it's going to be a problem for us. And people will look at us differently, people will say things about us, and that word could get to people who want to hurt us. And he realizes how he is viewed in Afghanistan. I don't say that as a means of complimenting myself, because obviously I didn't realize it until I'd gone through this experience, so I didn't really know that much. But the point is that there are deeper things going around in a sea around us that affect people in very meaningful ways that I think are driving the conflict to a great extent. But that's simply an anecdote. It probably went longer than we wanted it to. But so let me talk more in terms of evidence about what's there about this claim I'm making. So I'd say Islam, intertwined with Afghans' history of resistance, gave the Taliban an ability to inspire their fighters and unify and discipline them, that a Western-installed government that has notions of tribalism behind it, secular notions, even democracy behind it, cannot match. The government needed thousands of troops to secure a single district. The Taliban need hundreds, a few hundreds. Even in places like Kandahar City and Kabul, where the Taliban aren't terribly well liked, they can run operations, but when they do that, you know, they know that their guys involved in this operation, high chance of death, high chance of getting wounded in the awful ride back to Pakistan or somewhere else before they're treated. Not much money in the operations generally. They may kill some people, they're generally not successful in getting their target. But still, they do it. Taliban will defend an area with a few hundred men against us. The government doesn't do similar things. That's not to say all of the government doesn't do similar things. I know some folks that are tremendously aggressive and do things equivalent, if not better than the Taliban. But these are exceptions to the rule. These are units and singular tribes, not a movement, which is what the Taliban have. And so a variety of evidence points more of this out. And I want to walk through a few different types of the evidence on it. Now, so first, we have a lot of interviews and experiences that show a tie between Islam and Afghan identity and Taliban morale. There was an old school in Garmsar, a white school that was built by USAID in the early 2000s. We went to that school. It had been an area under Taliban control for a long time. It was covered in graffiti and with the names of famous Taliban commanders that had gone running up and down the district. The things they said were interesting. Karzai says he is a Muslim. He is not. He is working for the infidel. Or I'm a mujahideen. I will stay until I drive the foreigners out of the country. And this is far from the only evidence I encountered about this. I had the chance to interview many Taliban who had decided to go over to the government to stop fighting. And when you ask them, why were you fighting? The usual reason they gave was, we're fighting a jihad against you because we want to establish an Islamic emirate and you shouldn't be here. And some of that is, of course, propaganda, but you heard it so much, it became something very dangerous to decide that you wanted to discount. We were young, we decided to fight. We wanted to fight the infidel. The district governor came to my home, he told me foreigners in Afghanistan, they were going to conquer our country. I was convinced. So those, again, are little bits of information. So what does the polling say? The polling, the Asia Foundation 2014 annual survey, which is widely considered the most authoritative survey of Afghanistan, this year in 2014 found that 32% of Afghans have some sympathy for the Taliban, and within that 32%, or just 33% total, women, 30%, think the same thing. The figure has fallen from a stunning 56% in 2009. So that's not an insurgency when the majority of the people decide that they don't like the government. That's a much bigger problem. Now, although only 5% of these respondents said the Taliban are fighting to support Islam, another 35%, which would be the overall plurality, said they were fighting because of the presence of foreign troops or to gain power, both of which reasons are strongly tied to Islam. Similarly, the 2012 survey of the Afghans who strongly sympathized with the Taliban, 77% said they sympathized because of Islam or because they were fighting foreign resistance. Now, more importantly, direct interviews with the actual Taliban, and there's been a variety of them besides some of the modest work that I did, find the majority cite fighting the infidel, establishing Islamic Emirate is the reason why they are fighting. Now, again, propaganda could be a part that's playing a role in here, but the evidence is still very, you can't ignore what that's saying, and it seems to suggest something that's important. Now, on top of this evidence, on top of this is evidence that shows not just a tie between sympathy for the Taliban and Islam and Afghan identity, but that it's actually something that is increasing their morale, making them more willing to take risk. So one preeminent tribal leader, and I've heard many quotes this way, said, Taliban fighters are better than Afghan soldiers or police. The Taliban fight with little equipment, weapons, and ammunition. They fight well because they are inspired by mullahs and by jihad. Anyone working for the government is known as an infidel. The government has few religious leaders to inspire the army and police in the same way. General Razik, I don't know if you've heard of General Razik or not, but he is a very determined Taliban opponent, to put it lightly. He is not someone who is anywhere in their camp. He may or may not be someone we want in our camp. He said, Taliban morale is very high. Look at their suicide bombers. The Taliban motivate people to do incredible things. And if you want to quote Mullah Omar himself, he says, for us, life is not so dear that we will not spend it for our religion. Indeed, our death and life is all for Allah and for the path of Allah. We are happy to sacrifice and leave our pride aside. And of course, some of that is propaganda, but that propaganda is affecting the fighters that are under him, I think. The government can't claim that similar dedication to Islam. You know, there's a religious community in Afghanistan that's extremely important. The religious leadership, the village mullahs, the scholars, they're an extremely important source of legitimacy for the government and the Taliban. By most people's estimates, only a small minority of that religious leadership is actually with the government, that most of them prefer the Taliban. And I will never forget sitting with one leader from Garmsir, who I found to be wise and gentle and caring about the people. This religious leader said, the Taliban government was better than Karzai's, it was better for Islam, it was better for human rights, it was better for the people. I had one experience when I was sitting and talking to one of the founders of the Taliban. And we were talking about elections, and I used the word democracy. And he said, Carter, don't call it democracy. I understand what you're saying. What you mean is elections. Democracy for us, that's secular. That's almost like communism. So that has a problem for us. Elections, people getting together and deciding who they want to rule, that's not a problem for us. So that's part of the inspiration that the Taliban see. The other thing is the unity and discipline that they were able to instill. The Taliban didn't have this kind of infighting problem that the government had. The Taliban were more unified. They had certain, if on a district level you didn't have, the government's got a police chief, it's got an army chief, it has a district governor, it has an intelligence chief, and none of them report to each other. The Taliban just have one guy. That one guy reports to the provincial governor, and he reports to the deputy commander of all the Taliban, and he reports to Mullah Omar. It's cleaner. That's not to say it's perfect like that. It's not to say they don't have problems, and I've simplified it a little. I'm making a claim as if it's always like that. No, there's obviously problems in it. But it works cleaner and more efficiently than the government's does. They were able to reduce their internal competition to such a degree that it wasn't a threat to their rule. And to go back to Razik, who is again not a friend of the Taliban at all, he explained, the government has no loyalty to a single leader. There are 34 provinces, each with its own leader, a governor, army commander, police chief, NDS director. The Taliban do not have these organizations. Taliban are just Taliban. Now, true, these successes are partly due to infamously harsh punishments. I would argue that those harsh punishments aren't possible if you don't have organization, discipline, and people listening to you in the first place. It's not like the government doesn't have its own problem with harsh punishments sometimes. And if you look in terms of history, Islam has often provided leaders with a framework, norms, and principles by which to better organize themselves. Ibn Khaldun, the famous Arab historian, noted that religious leaders, Muslim leaders, were better able to create a movement than the fractured tribal leaders often were. So it's not a terribly new concept. So in this regard, I'd say the Taliban were models of how to wage war in Afghanistan. Our billion-dollar enterprise to enforce security via our own methods, I don't think it had that much on the Taliban's rudimentary Islamic system. Now, to sum it all up, to sum up the argument about discipline and about Islam and Afghan identity, the Taliban practiced norms and ideas from Islam that were deeply grounded in Afghan identity and Afghan society. These held authority and legitimacy. Thereby, the Taliban inspired unified and disciplined movement. None of this to say is the government was unsupported. That's not true. The government had people supporting it. It was able to recruit people, large numbers of people, to fight in its, to fight for it. The polls show that large numbers of people supported the government. The point is the Taliban had an edge. And that edge meant they could survive our surge and rapidly return to the offensive and to a position of legitimacy. Now, this isn't the only problems that occurred. We worsened our own position by doing a variety of things. We had a ruinous relationship with President Karzai. We failed to use our considerable leverage, our money, and the fact we had so many troops in the country to get better governors, cleaner generals, better generals in place. We let Pakistan, it sounds harsh to say, we let them give the Taliban a free ride for too many years. And we had no plan really to create peace talks until very late in the game. So these are all mistakes we made. But I'd still say that yet after 2006, the United States could not have gotten to the Afghan government to a point that would have allowed total withdrawal within an acceptable time frame of, say, 5 to 8 years. It wasn't something that was really even in the cards. So even if you did a drastic change, if you removed Karzai, or if you got Pakistan to attack the Taliban safe havens there, they're unlikely to have removed the Taliban from all of the areas in the country and in Pakistan where they were living. You could make some changes, but you weren't going to get rid of this fundamental problem. And so you might say, well, why couldn't Pakistan, so often the villain of this story, why couldn't they clean out the Taliban and make it impossible for them to live there? Well, that's not really reasonable to ask the Pakistani government to do, because they will face then the same Islamic problem, the same identity problems that the Afghan government and we do. So it's not really something that you can expect them to do. The hopes that a surge could bring victory in the United States could set up a government that could stand on its own a reasonable amount of time were probably quite misplaced. I think the choice was to stay in Afghanistan for decades, hoping that the government was slowly going to get better and better and that we'd have to put less and less money in, or to get out. I think I still have 5 minutes, so I'm going to be able to wrap up, I think. So I'd say this leads to a final and less studied question. Why didn't the United States just get out? You can think of some points where that seems that they might have been logical. Say in 2002, after the original 2001 attack. Maybe in 2006, after the Taliban come back and things aren't looking so good. How about 2009, when we're making the surge decision? Or more recently, 2011, when we withdrawal plan, or this year, when President Obama laid out how he wanted to get out. So my intuition is, and I did a little bit more research on this, but my intuition is that for most of that time, it wouldn't have been politically feasible for us to do that. I think in 2002 and 2006, abandoning Afghanistan would have appeared irresponsible in the wake of 2001. I think that it would have been, there was a great deal of public support for the activities that were going on in Afghanistan. And if Bush at that time had said, we're getting out and we're leaving, I think he would have thought he was going to face I think it would have been hard for him to do that if he had wanted to do it. I'm not saying he did want to do it. I don't think he did. Even in 2009, when President Obama had the chance to pull out, he wasn't in much of a position to do that. He had declared it the good war in his presidential campaign for political reasons. And even the debate over the surge, which gets a lot of play as this great debate between two different courses where we took the wrong path, The debate was over having a total of 90,000 U.S. forces in the country versus 100,000 U.S. forces in the country. It wasn't about pulling out entirely. So just the fact that at that point it wasn't really even on the table makes me question how feasible of an option it was at that time. So it's not until 2009 when the popular support starts to shift, and then after that when the surge fails, then it becomes a reasonable option that's discussed in Washington to pull out and not be in Afghanistan anymore. Now, I'm not saying all of that is necessary. That's not rock solid. Like I said, I need to do a little more research on that. But what I see off of that intuition is the possibility that after the initial stakes of 2001 to 2006, the United States may have been to some extent trapped in a war that was going to go to defeat, or at very best, a long stalemate. At the end of 13 years of war, and this is the last paragraph, so I think I'm going to make it. At the end of 13 years of war, I have a strong suspicion that our intervention may have done more harm than good to the Afghan people. Afghanistan's entire 35 years of conflict since 1978-79 can to some extent be traced to foreign intervention. The Soviets intervened, and that led to years of jihad and civil war. That started to settle in 1994, 95, 96, 97, when the Taliban come in and were able to organize things and change the country. The Taliban then are pushed out by us. We make some mistakes. The Taliban managed to regain enough inertia to come back, and by 2009, again, are establishing a second regime. They were again pushed out by us. So they had a large, inertia to make things happen. I'm not saying that the Taliban are good. I'm not saying they're better than us by any means. They oppress women, and I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion. They hollow out education. They suppress free speech. And we've done a lot of work in those areas that I think has been noble. I think we've had accomplishments there, and I'm happy to defend those things that we've done in that case. But if I'm going to try to be objective, which is hard after spending so much time in Afghanistan, I have to weigh those things against the damage that we've done, the people who have died, the losses that have occurred. I have to weigh them against the fact that while the Taliban are more oppressive, let's say, towards women than the government is, tribal leaders in general aren't terribly nice to women. And I also have to ask, we put all this effort in, does any of that matter if we leave now? And it all falls apart. And I'm not saying we should leave or we shouldn't leave. It's just the end balance that we face today. So on that, a little bit of a grim note, I'm going to conclude, and I think we'll open it to questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carter. Let me note that after our question and answer period, we'll have a small reception. We'll have some wine, crackers, cheese, and so on, so that if your question isn't answered during this period, or if you want to press him further on a point, you're welcome to do it at that point. And it's a chance for people to talk among themselves as well about this or other topics. I noted that this microphone isn't broadcasting my voice, but it does broadcast for the video we're making, so that when people watch this subsequently, they're able to hear the question from the floor. So I'll take questions, and I'll ask people to pass the microphone to the person if I can't reach them directly, so that they can use the microphone. And again, it's for the benefit of the recording. So let me open the floor now to questions and offer people a chance to question Carter, all the way in the back.
So first question is the failed state problem and the possibility of the breeding ground for terrorism. I mean, that was one of the main reasons that we felt we just could not be involved.
Yes.
And the second issue is the rise of fundamentalist Islam and how that played into the Afghan dynamic. I was in Afghanistan in '66. Fundamentalist Islam was not an issue. So that whole change in the Muslim world changed the dynamic of everything that happens in Afghanistan. Goes back to the failed state problem again, too, and the terrorist breeding camp problem. So we were faced with irreconcilable issues. And that's where we are today. If we withdraw completely, do we go back to failed state, breeding camps, that sort of thing?
So failed states can be a breeding ground, a haven for terrorism. I think that is in general true, and I'm happy, I think that's true. And I think that if we leave, the Taliban are not the same thing as Al-Qaeda by any means. But I do think Al-Qaeda will come back to Afghanistan. I do think they will try to do things that threaten the United States. The question for us is that something we should just live with? And that to me is the fundamental question that exists on that particular issue. We have to ask, do we have an ability to control these areas? Do we have an ability to change things that much? Well, we probably do, but it's at a very high cost. Do we want to pay that high cost, or do we want to deal with the possibility, not the 100% absolute that there's going to be an attack on the United States? We want to deal with the possibility that there could be an attack on the United States. Other countries deal with that possibility. And they don't attack, they don't get involved in these kind of conflicts. So that is something to think about seriously. The rise of fundamentalist Islam, yes. That rose throughout the area, and then spread to Afghanistan to a certain extent, but also because of the civil war environment because the Soviets came in and we helped create the resistance, and Islam was an easy way to unify people and draw people together. There's a similar theme again. That gained more credence. And then because in the Civil War period, there was even more anarchy, and Islam became a way to defeat that anarchy and bring some order to the state, that allowed fundamentalist Islam to rise even further. And I mean, we'd have to debate on exactly what fundamentalist Islam is and what it isn't. I mean, I think there's many parts of the Taliban that aren't fundamentalist at all, but I think you're right. And in general, throughout the area, there's been a rise of a different form of Islam that's also had a great ability to influence these countries. I'd agree with that.
Hello. You mentioned many of these scenarios that had the U.S. strategy been different, would there have been a better situation? I was actually wondering, sort of in a scenario, because Karzai has often been cited as sort of an obstacle in many cases to the policies that the U.S. wanted to input in Afghanistan. And as you mentioned, he fostered like ethnic divisions and did not help cover them up. And I know that, for instance, Ghani has been painted as a more pragmatic, pro-Western leader. And had there been someone like him introduced earlier to Afghanistan, would U.S. and ISAF forces have been able to form a better template for the future of Afghanistan with more collaboration between Afghanistan and the West, or would that simply have spurred even greater anti-Western fervor among the Taliban?
I think Ashraf Ghani, or first of all, Karzai, at the time that he became president, he appeared like a great leader. Karzai is also not as bad of a leader as people like to make him out to be. He understands some of the details of Afghan foreign policy. He understands the details of tribal relations. He has a sense for the balance of things that we often don't have. And many Afghans do look at him as having been a legitimate leader, even if tainted by his association with us. There's a book by Bet Adam. It's called Man in a Motorcycle. And it's about Karzai when he first became, when Kandahar was falling and we were fighting to remove the Taliban in 2001. You may have heard the story that Karzai gets on a motorcycle, he rides to Uruzgan, where his tribe is based, and he has lots of connections. And he rides with just two other people, and he starts to raise the tribe against the Taliban at tremendous risk to himself. Doesn't quite work out, so he has to go back with a very small team of U.S. Special Forces. And when you you see, when you read her story, and she's not trying to paint Karzai as a great man, she's rather critical of him. But it's hard not to say, wow, that is a brave man. I can't believe he did that. And then when she describes the other candidates for president, people who've been sitting in Italy for the past 2 decades. And it's hard not to think, well, if I was making that decision, maybe I would have made the wrong decision, but I would have gone with Karzai. And I would have said that I would have thought that he's a good person for the United States to think is going to be put in charge. So I'm leery of saying that replacing Karzai would have been a key, would have made a huge amount of difference. I think we easily could have gotten ourselves in as much trouble as good. I think one of the big mistakes we made was in 2009, if you read Gates's book Duty, we really tried to remove Karzai. We tried to, not like we did with Diem, but we tried to promote other candidates to become president. And that didn't have the best effect. I'm not generally in favor of trying to remove other countries' presidents, but if you're going to do it, don't mess it up. Because the negative effects on that, the destruction that did to our relationship with Karzai was breathtaking. And well, we should have expected it to be. I mean, why would you expect him to act any differently after that had happened? So that's answer on that.
If I could just add a couple of points. I was at the State Department in 2001, 2003, and my boss, Richard Haass, was immediately after September 11th named the Special Ambassador of the United States to Afghanistan to try and organize our diplomatic response. And in that capacity, he planned and made a trip then to Italy to talk with King Zahir Shah. And Carter mentioned people who had been sitting in Italy for several decades and being now brooded about as possible new leaders for a liberated, if you will, a liberated Afghanistan. And when Richard came back from that, he was singularly unimpressed with Zahir Shah's ability to move from an Italian villa, and imagine yourself in that position at the age of 75 or so, and ask yourself if you'd rather stay on in the villa in Italy or go to Kabul. Those of us who've been to Kabul would not have any trouble making the decision in terms of lifestyle. But then also later on in 2009, I was in the National Intelligence Office for South Asia, so I was privy to a lot of the discussions in the sit room about how to proceed. And Richard Holbrooke had been named as the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Richard Holbrooke was a very powerful bureaucratic player. He had a powerful personality. He was very dynamic. He was clearly, and this came across in all the internal meetings, in favor of Ashraf Ghani in 2009 in the election. The problem was that he made that quite clear to Mr. Karzai when he would meet as the singular most powerful representative of the United States, having the imprimatur both of President Obama, who personally didn't like him, and that was palpable in the interactions in the sit room. But he, more importantly, had the backing of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And so when he showed up in Kabul, he was speaking for the United States. And despite the fact that Ashraf Ghani wasn't polling more than 10%, I think at best, during the campaign, it was nonetheless clear that the U.S., in the person of Holbrooke, with his powerful personality, was on his side. This did not sit well with Karzai, nor when the election was completed and Mr. Holbrooke then returned to Kabul and made the case that there should not be, that this was not final, that there should be a runoff. It further soured the relations and made Karzai feel quite suspicious of what U.S. intentions were. So it started off very well in 2001. Karzai was looked on in many circles as the best available candidate at the meetings that were held in Berlin in December, in Germany in 2001, December. It was clear that he was really the only available candidate. He had acquitted himself, as Carter described it, on the battlefield. There weren't a lot of people standing up as alternatives to him. So.
In your role as a devil's advocate with regard to U.S. policy, I wonder if as you're quite correctly seeing the failure of U.S. policy, you're not overstating the success of the Taliban. And so clearly they are doing well, they are rising as we're getting out, and we haven't done well. And I guess at that point I wonder about the third element, which is Afghan identity. And you are assuming the link between fundamentalist Islam an Afghan identity. But what may be key to Afghan identity is tribal decentralization, that the different peoples in Afghanistan may want to identify with their locality and not whoever is running Afghan government and therefore making claim to Afghan identity.
So you are right that I am definitely simplifying what the Taliban have done, and I have taken away a lot of their weaknesses and a lot of the other things and details that are there for the sake of simplicity. Because I don't want to bore you and put you to sleep as I talk about different things and add too much complexity into the conversation. So, and by simplifying it, I've made them sound better, more disciplined, more inspirational than they probably are in reality. But I still think that they have a distinct edge in that. I think that the connection between, on the identity piece, so first of all, I'd say that my argument now would be simply that they have a better tie to Islam, not fundamentalist Islam, simply Islam, than the government does, for all those reasons I put out. The fundamentalist issue is a different issue that I probably need to grapple with a little more. Now, with identity, it took a long time, but my Pashto eventually became good enough to start reading Pashtun historians in Pashto writing about their history, and about Ahmad Shah Durrani, about the Iron Emir Abdul Rahman Khan, about this whole period. I've had a chance to read some of the poetry they've written. I've had a chance to read letters Abdul Rahman wrote to his son, things his mother said to him. And the notion of an Afghan identity based on fighting foreign resistance, I would argue, is quite thick. I don't discount that the tribal piece is important, but this Afghan identity piece is very clearly there, and it's not just something that arose after the British intervention of 1840. It proceeds long before that, in terms of the fighting Genghis Khan, the fights against the Mughals. There are famous poets, Abdurrahman Baba and Khoshala Khan Khattak, who both are writing about this, and this becomes infused in Afghans' ideas of what to do and in their proverbs. And then onwards into Ahmad Shah himself and Mirwais Nika and the removal of the Safavids. So it's something that's there, and the more I read about it, the more I'm impressed with that. And to give another example, so the Iron Emir, Abdul Rahman Baba, Abdul Rahman Khan, he created the Afghan state, the centralized system as it exists today. He brought the country back together after years of civil war, cleared out areas that had been rejecting the government, established an army, did all the things we think about in terms of state building. And he was harsh and he was brutal, but I think for most Westerners, when you read about Afghan history, it's hard not to see this guy as a major figure. Afghans think of him as a disgrace. They prefer Amanullah Khan, who led the war against the British in 1919 that was not really the greatest military exploit of history. And then after that, he ruled very poorly, such that there was a tribal revolt that removed him. But he is the Ghazi. He is the one who is an Islamic warrior. Abdul Rahman Khan is thoroughly disliked because he allowed the Durand Line to be formed. And he took money from behind his back from the British. So those are some of the reasons that I feel strongly that identity and resistance to foreign intervention is something that's pretty important for Afghans.
But what if there's no foreign intervention? Then what happens?
In terms of the government?
Yeah, in terms of what the Afghan tribal member wants. Does he maybe want to be left alone once there's no one to resist from outside?
So partly, yes, he would want to be, that could be true, but if there's disorder, he's going to want stability. And he is not going to, if there's someone who's going to bring order and stop the disorder from happening, that will stop the tribes from fighting each other, people won't oppose that person. Once that person shows they're strong enough to do it. The tribe will still exist within that, but a singular tribe was not going to sacrifice itself against a movement that can bring people together.
So I know your talk was, focused on Afghanistan and Afghan identity and Afghan Islamic identity, but I'm wondering if we can apply any of these lessons to ISIS, to, I guess, Islamic identity there,
Yeah.
or maybe national identity as well.
So from my time in Iraq, I'm familiar with ISIS and its incarnation as AQI, as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I think there are some lessons there, but there are differences. The important thing to remember is that I've studied this case as a singular Afghanistan case. So I'm not comfortable with generalizing much from it. I looked at the particular evidence that exists in Afghanistan to come to the results for Afghanistan. But there is obviously, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was able to maintain enough support over several years and able to come back in a fairly impressive fashion. Obviously, they have some appeal to people, including to Europeans and Americans, Canadians who go over there. So there is something there of some similarity. In the past, my experience has been that Al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS don't have the kind of unity the Taliban have had. The Taliban have some different characteristics that they made them more united, more disciplined than the other organizations have been. Now, the other thing with ISIS, I think to think about is what's the long-term game here? Is ISIS something that is going to go away entirely? Or are all these wars and conflicts going to keep on proceeding to some extent, not be something you can totally eradicate? And we should be thinking a lot in the ISIS situation about if we're involved, how long are we going to have to be involved? And so say maybe we want to be involved to some extent, how do we do that without getting ourselves too trapped? How do we condition ourselves, force ourselves to face the fact that it's going to be long, and use our resources in the best way to address that?
You've made a pretty good case that the Taliban can fight better, but can they govern better? A lot has changed since they were in charge in the late 20th century. A lot of technology, both for warfare and for like the rise of social media and various things, cell phones even, that didn't exist when they were around the first time. I mean, it's 2015. Can they run not a modern country, but a contemporary country?
If the Taliban run the country, so in terms of social media, they're quite good. So they'll do okay on that one. But in terms of other elements of development, in terms of education, in terms of giving people representation, they're going to have some difficulties there. And the state that one would see formed from that would not be as progressive as the state that exists now. Wouldn't be able to help its people as much because it wouldn't have the expertise it needs to do that. So it would be a poorer state. It would be a state where people don't get to live the same kind of lives that they do now. One of the problems that the Taliban had in 1994 to 2001 was that they'd have schools. They'd have a lot of villages with the mosque, people would go to school, but they had trouble then getting a high school level of education to people. And so people eventually become dissatisfied and a little bit unhappy with that. But what they don't become dissatisfied enough to do is revolt or go to war in some way like that.
Well, Mullah Omar was never particularly interested in those days in running a state. He had a kind of a religious scrim over the principles that he was trying to enact, but he didn't seem, nor did the people in charge of him seem, in charge of the various regions, seem to have any interest in the electrical grid working, the water systems working, agricultural trade proceeding. I mean, the things that governments need to do to have a halfway successful state.
So a lot of people who were there at the time have told me that they found that the Taliban did care about those things and wanted to do things like get water working, wanted to have some kind of projects done to clean out the canals, wanted to have trade flow, but they didn't have enough experience and know-how to make it happen. So they bumbled and made a lot of mistakes. And now you're right that Mullah Omar himself didn't have a lot of interest into it, and of course things need to flow from the top. So they had some interest, but I mean, in the end, I agree with you. They don't do things as well in that regard. They have the same kind of problems there. There are a few things they do better. Their rule of law is quicker, is less corrupt than the current Afghan system is. I don't want to overrate that. I want to be careful on that because all rule of law is a bit iffy in Afghanistan. But they definitely have an edge in that regard too. So in the end, I'd say that how the situation for the people in development and governance would be worse under a Taliban rule, I think, overall. But years of war haven't been good for them either.
Given this rather dismal story, what would you recommend the United States do next?
I figured that one would come up. So there's a few choices the United States has. One option is to carry on with President Obama's plan to go down to we're at 9,800 for most of this year. We'll go down to 5,500 in 2016, and after that, we're supposed to go just down to an embassy presence in 2017. Following that strategy, come at the end of 2016, we're going to be facing a choice, and probably at the end of this year, we'll be facing a choice of do we want to pull back. Having a better idea at that point that pulling back is going to mean that the country is going to lose more, it's going to become more unstable. So that's going to be a difficult decision to make at that time. A second option is just to, let's stay in, let's put more in, let's put more troops in, well, not many more troops, but enough to make various generals happy, put more money into it. But that too leaves you with a situation of doing this for year after year after year after year. And Stephen Biddle, in a great article in Foreign Affairs, said you're putting yourselves in a war of attrition between the Taliban's will to fight and the Congress's will to fund. So it's not that too doesn't leave the best of options. We could get out, and we could leave entirely. That brings up the things that I mentioned before, that I do think if we get out, you will see some kind of terrorist group emerge there that could, not necessarily could, pose a threat to the United States. And that may be worth it, or that may just put us in the same situation we're in Iraq and against ISIS again, where all of a sudden the president has put himself in a position where he needs to now go back in again. My preference is I think we should try harder to pursue some kind of peace talks and negotiations with the Taliban. That's not because I think that it's likely to be successful. I think it's more likely to be unsuccessful. But we're probably going to stay in Afghanistan until 2017 at least. If we're going to stay in that long, we should make efforts to get to some kind of peace agreement. And when I say peace agreement, I'm not sure you'd get a peace agreement in the conventional sense of having both sides agree to everything. But I think if you start talks, you can open yourselves up to new possibilities and new directions that things could go. We would have to be willing in doing that to give the Taliban things like a very major role in government. We'd have to be willing to have elections again, because the Taliban aren't going to go for this unless there's a new set of elections where they get to play in it. We'd have to be willing to restructure the state, and we'd have to be willing to renegotiate the Constitution and be willing to fight over the women's rights pieces within the Constitution so the Taliban don't take those away. So it's not, while going for peace also often sounds a cheap thing, an easy thing to do, it's actually not. It takes some political capital, but I think it's better than what the options are. And I think the cost of it isn't light, but it's worth doing rather than just waiting until 2017 to face a bunch of bad choices.
I know there are always a lot of questions, but I wanted to leave the last for Carter's mentor here at Berkeley. So Bob Powell has the last question.
Thanks, Neil. So Carter, despite my being in the political science department, you wisely were in the history department and went off to do your PhD in that. So I'm reluctant to press a historian to generalize, but I do want to follow up on a little bit of the other comment earlier that touched on ISIL in Iraq, because I'm not completely sure to what extent there's a sort of general principle here in Afghanistan or something particular to it, because it is striking, just the broad overview of a very disciplined, well-organized soldier or group per group, much more effective fighting force, that is the Taliban, than the government, that overruns positions of the government, partly because of not enough ammunition, incompetent leadership. And if I drop Taliban and I put in ISIL, I now get essentially the story of the sort of spring offensive and the fall of Mosul and the subsequent events. But there, at least the press is attaching, the source of causation there is the oppression of the Sunnis being oppressed by the Iraqi leadership and essentially not having a stake in it, all of which may be true, but that's a very different flavor than some of the things that you're highlighting in Afghanistan. And so if you have a successful insurgent group, presumably they're going to be unified for by something, and is that the key to understanding, or is it just the sort of more driver of, inept organization coming from the government, or possibly both?
So I think it's layers. So there's layers of causes that are there. So if you take the Iraq example, and I could use the same example for Afghanistan, you're going to have layers of necessary conditions for what is causing this event to happen. And so say one necessary condition is ISIS is organized enough or has enough inspiration, has enough movement to make something happen, to create some kind of threat. Another necessary condition is that the tribes, whether the Sunni tribes or the Pashtun tribes, aren't organized enough to get together, or not used by the government in a way to make things work. Now in the Afghan case, you have the Taliban exists and they're coming at the tribes. So let's say, play counterfactual, the tribes are all organized and are together and they're working with the government. You're still rolling the dice if the tribes are going to succeed or not. So even if they could still lose because the Taliban are there and organized and have some degree of unity themselves and have some ability to inspire and rally people together. So these two conditions are clashing with each other. In the Afghan case, I would put more weight on the inspiration and discipline ability of the Taliban to do these things as the more important of the two. The other one's still a necessary condition, and I can't play it without that being there. But the other one is more important because also I could play this that, okay, the tribes are organized, the Taliban are here, or Al-Qaeda's here, and I'm playing the game in 2014, in 2010, Taliban attack. I'm playing again in 2011, 2012, 2013. The odds are one of those times the government may break. Not the odds are, but there's a chance this is going to happen. So that's why I'd say that that one's important. But in the ISIS case, what would be important there is to truly understand what happened in 2014 in these areas, to get an idea of what came first. Did ISIS come first, or did the breakup of the tribes come first? And then you'd have a better idea of which thing to put more value on. Does that answer the question? Okay.
You get an A.
Before we break for a glass of wine, a bit of cheese, and further discussion, please let's have one more thank you to Carter Malkasian, proud Berkeley graduate.